Thanks everyone, welcome. I can throw away the first half page of my notes because it was going to be introducing the panelists, but you did such a good job of that, so thank you. My name is Simon, and today we're really going to dig in and explore how startups and corporates can work together. Before we get stuck in, why don't I give you both a chance just to quickly introduce yourselves. Nick, starting with you, and then you, Eddie, just to give the audience an understanding of the perspective that you'll be answering these questions from, and then we'll dive into about 30 minutes of a conversation here on stage, leaving 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please jot them down. There will be a time for you to ask them at the end of the session. So yeah, over to you, Nick.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. So as indicated, my name is Nicholas Kolesh. I'm Vice President of Projects at the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And as the name suggests, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste is addressing the plastic waste challenge. And we're actually a non-profit organization headquartered here in Singapore, but with a foundation based in the US. And we are effectively organized amongst the plastic industry. So we have various players from the plastics value chain, from petrochemical and plastics producers, converters, brand owners, retailers, recycling companies, as well as waste management companies. And we've got about 70 members representing most of the largest players in those parts of the value chain. And they've come together really to collaborate and help to solve the plastic waste issue. And we do that through utilizing their funding to fund projects. And effectively, that's my responsibility, is overseeing the project activities that the Alliance undertakes. And that is in quite a number of areas, which we'll get into as we go through the discussions. Pass it to Eddie.
Thank you. I'm Eddie Lee. I'm the Managing Director at Startup Bootcamp Australia. So Startup Bootcamp is one of the largest corporate accelerator in the world. It specializes in thematic accelerator programs with various corporates, for example, in fintech, in food tech. But I'm the Managing Director of Energy Tech. Specifically, I'm working with Mitsubishi as a client to help them in a program called Decarbonize, where they are using through the help of a Startup Bootcamp, doing a global search for the best-in-class startups for collaboration to form a proof of concept and to go to the market and build up new business opportunity, perhaps a new future revenue in decarbonized world. So before I joined Startup Bootcamp, I've always been in the venture and the startup world. I have my own fund where I invested in a number of startups, both in the US and also in Southeast Asia. For example, companies like Ion Mobility, which is a two-wheeler e-mobility solution. I have companies such as Rigetti Quantum Computing based out of the US. And before that, I was in academic. I spent time in Stanford working in the lab, creating MRI machines to make things faster, cheaper, and trying to bring them to the market. And I was pitching to VCs like Excel, Kostler, and eventually joined the dark side when I joined one of the Bay Area funds that brought me from academic to venture.
Great, thanks. And I hope that gives the audience an understanding of the perspective that each of the panelists will bring to answering the questions. And just in full disclosure, Nick is actually a funder of my company, Second Muse. So it's nice actually for me, Nick, to be asking the questions for a change instead of having to answer them. So Nick, over to you. You spoke about the Alliance representing some of the world's biggest companies. How do you organise and work with your members, to kind of collaborate with the entrepreneurial ecosystem, to fund the ecosystem, and to find ways for your companies to collaborate with startups?
Great. Yeah, and innovation is actually one of the 4 core pillars of the Alliance. So when we were set up, the focus was really on, a lot of it on waste management. So the vast majority of the people in the world, there's more than 3 billion people who lack access to basic collection of waste management. So a big focus we have is on collection, which can be quite a basic activity, collection and processing of waste. But there's actually a lot of other activities that go on in this space to drive a circular economy for plastic. And that's where our second pillar comes in, which is innovation. And so we work quite diligently in that space with our member companies who have obviously multi-billion-dollar innovation budgets on their own, but also with the startup landscape. So we've engaged in quite a number of different ways with this ecosystem. So we work with companies like Second Muse through the incubation network, where we have some very distinct and bespoke challenges, looking to identify startups that have novel solutions, especially in South and Southeast Asia, where there's real challenges. We've also worked at a broader scale with an organization called Plug and Play, so another startup accelerator. We created the End Plastic Waste Innovation Platform. And a big part of that has been the engagement of our member companies in the assessment of startups. And this has happened actually around the world. We've had 7 locations, starting in Paris, Silicon Valley, here in Singapore, as well as recently in Shanghai, Sao Paulo, and Johannesburg, and most recently actually this first quarter of the year in Tokyo. And in this program, we are actually using the network of Plug and Play to identify what has now been more than 3,000 startups around the world who have come up with solutions to address the plastic waste challenge. And we use our member companies to actually sit on the panels to assess these submissions. And from every round, we're having about 10 finalists. So it's been a great opportunity not only to expose what new technologies are out there to address plastic waste in areas of recycling, mechanical and chemical recycling, but also the downstream usage of plastic waste in new products, recycled plastic that can be used obviously in many, many ways. But also thinking about new business models, new ways to engage communities. So very broad base of activities. And through those engagement of our member companies, they've actually been making connections with these startups. And we have multiple cases of, for example, companies like Dow, material science company, that has engaged with a company called Bifusion. They're making construction blocks out of waste plastic, and they've actually provided some investment there. Lots and lots of examples that we can get into as we move through. So one of the areas that we focused on is innovation working with startups.
Wonderful, thanks Nick. And Eddie, from your perspective, what do you think draws corporates into engaging with startups? What attracts a corporate from coming to Startup Bootcamp and sort of saying, this is a problem that we solve, this is the type of problem that we think startups are really going to be able to solve for us?
To answer the question, I'll take one step back, that corporate innovation in the past was an internal process where the opportunities, new product lines can be identified through strategic research and a team formed within the corporate to tackle the problem internally. But as corporates progress, there's an opportunity now for them to engage with startups at an earlier stage instead of waiting for the ultimate M&A and consolidation and integration. By going upstream and working with startups that are at an earlier stage, there are a number of advantages. You're accessing technology, first of all, at the earlier stages, albeit at a lower TRL level, less mature, but these are essentially opportunities that are on the verge of hitting product market fit and being able to be significant, and potentially when they hit maturity, you have already established a relationship with the companies, and so being able to diligence whether the companies is the right one before integrating the company back through an M&A process. So at Startup Bootcamp, we solved the problem where it is essentially really difficult for corporates to identify the right startup to work with, part one. And the second step is that having identified the startup, what is the right process of working with the startup to ensure that the startup and the BU, right, who holds the budget, are happy working together to create an opportunity that might be looked upon as cannibalistic to the BU. So this is not a simple solution, and this is how we go about at Startup Bootcamp to solve the problem for energy clients such as Shell or Mitsubishi, where we scope for the right startup, we handhold both sides, we work with the client to let the BU learn startup way of thinking and working, and we help them all the way from the start to the identifying the proof of concept, rolling out a product with a business model that's sustainable, right, that is on track towards M&A in the future.
Eddie, you mentioned mergers and acquisitions as one of the sort of outcomes, but there are lots of different models that startups can think about and corporates can think about how they could engage with startups. Could you unpack some of those models for us, and what are some of those different sort of pathways and models that people could kind of have when they're coming in to start negotiate some of these partnerships?
Sure thing. So the most common form would be a corporate venture capital fund. And most of the Fortune 500 or even Fortune 1000 companies already have a corporate venture capital fund. The structure of this fund is somewhat similar to financial venture capital, where they are looking for minority stakes in startups. The fund itself could be $100 million to $200 million. Typically, they are investing in 30 companies with a pot of money. The corporate itself is the only investor. And when they have a portfolio of 20, 30 companies, the economics is that the fund itself makes money when the startups ultimately undergo an acquisition or IPO or SPAC. But let's bear in mind, right, for a corporate with a market cap of 10, 100 billion, right, a fund of 100 million, even if it's 5x, which is a top quartile performance for all funds, is not a drop in the ocean, especially when this money is spread over 10 years. So the real activity that moves the needle is the ability to create a new business opportunity for the company. It could be increasing the performance of one of their existing units by increasing revenue, increasing a new product line, or maybe even setting up an entire new business, right, that could represent 1% of the revenue. Essentially, corporates are using, one of the mechanisms, of course, is CVC, corporate venture capital. They are essentially looking for the new S-curve, right, where in Innovator's Dilemma, they describe how the new S-curve is hard to achieve because you have to overcome the chasm of cannibalization, etc. So corporate venture capital is one. Another model is running an accelerator in-house, right? Then it is attracting companies that are even earlier to run perhaps a 1 month, 2 month program with the corporate. And another way to engage startup is running something as simple as a hackathon, right? And all this I consider mechanisms for the top of the funnel, where you're looking for opportunity, where you want to get to know the startup, for the startup to get to know you. And as they propagate down the funnel, it becomes an M&A opportunity and finally potentially a new business for the corporate.
Great. So we've sort of spoken about the optimistic pathway, right? You're a startup, you meet a corporate, you go through a hackathon into an accelerator, and then you get a merger and acquisition offer. But it's not always so simple. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time on unpacking some of the challenges. And I think, Nick, particularly in our space, working on trying to address plastic leakage into the environment, there's not a ton of profitability. There's not the 100x type digital tech startups. These are often high street businesses that don't have the opportunity to scale. So what are some of the challenges that you've seen in your work working with startups, and how could we start to understand them better, and maybe what are some of the solutions to address some of those issues?
Yeah, no, indeed, Simon. I think one of the key challenges is that and it depends actually perhaps which industry you're in. So if you're in an industry that's been around for hundreds of years, there's quite a legacy of innovation, maybe a little bit stodgy, maybe not cutting edge, but that's also changing. But if you're in a more high tech or newer industry, I think there's a different dynamic. So in our space, it's a bit more traditional in terms of the manufacturing and the waste management and so on. Although there are, I would say, quite a number of new enterprises coming into this the sustainability space of recycling and recovery. But I think one of the key things is recognizing that there's a lot going on inside those companies, and it's probably the need to identify where would your niche be, right? What would it be that is going to be different than what might already be happening? And while a lot of that stuff is obviously confidential inside a big company, there are ways to understand from their sustainability strategy in particular where your opportunity might fit in. And again, I think the key there is to find those internal champions. And through industry organizations like, for example, our alliance, it's an actual entry point to find those people. And we talked about the corporate venture capitals, the CVCs. What we've also found is that the business units themselves, sometimes they want to move a bit faster or in a bit of a different direction than the CVC. So you can actually get in through those business connections that can be found, I would say, through the industry connection that could be made through associations and so on. So I think once you break that barrier, it's then really important to understand, is this something that they're already doing, right? Or is it something that they've seen 10, 20 times over? because you want to make sure that you're attaching yourself to a company that is going to see your solution as novel and not kind of spin your wheels a lot. And also in some of these companies, timing is an issue, availability of the resources that you need to connect to, of the people. So there's an appreciation of maybe sometimes the speed isn't what you think it should be, and they have a lot of things on their plate as well. So I think there's that understanding of the culture that you're going to face in what can be a big or traditional industry. And it can be quite different, I think, in some of the high-tech spaces that I think a lot of the people at this event are involved in.
I want to pull on a couple of threads here. One is this idea of cannibalization that you mentioned, and Nick, you didn't mention it directly, but finding a solution that's pre-competition, that you're not kind of getting inside a company and competing like, you know, a material science company, probably a startup, probably doesn't have the capacity to go toe-to-toe with a Dow Chemical, for example. So, Eddie, I'm really keen, you mentioned Mitsubishi, the work that you're doing with Mitsubishi. Are the programs that you're running with them, are they in-house, are they closed off, or are they something that can build the entire sector?
Right. The startups that they are looking for will require them to work with external startups, right? But it requires mobilization of internal mechanisms within the company as well. Here's the key, that every company has an innovation arm, right? Usually that is the champion. They are completely ready to engage with startups. But very often the collaborations do not happen for a variety of reasons. Let's face it, the only chance that startups have, right, in the face of a corporate with unlimited resources is focus and speed. Whereas from the corporate point of view, because of risk mitigation, because they are the incumbent, because of regulatory requirements, etc., they have a brand to protect. There has to be steps to be overcome in order for them to check that a solution is really working before adopting. So that's why startup have a chance. Now, when the innovation team brings a startup to work with the business unit, they are now having a conundrum of one side of the corporate innovation team wanting to work with the startup, whereas the BU wanting to slow things down, right? So there are some opposing forces there. And at Startup Bootcamp, we are aware of that, and hence we play the middleman to work with not just the innovation team, but also the business unit directly to identify potentially Gen Z or people with Gen Z thinking, to identify the early adopters within the BU who put up their hands and say that they want to be the internal champion. We equip them with the right skills, right? This could be executives from Shell or Mitsubishi, right? To let them know what's the best practices in lean startup methodology, the use of the BMC when mentoring the startups, and we call them mentors. Effectively, they are internal champion who handhold the startup and walk them through the corporate decision-making process to make sure that the right resources is brought in front of the startup to pay attention, right? So that the new S-curve has a chance.
So this is a really interesting shift that I've recognized working in the sector over the last 5 to 10 years. I think 10 years ago, we used to focus all of our attention on building the capacity of the entrepreneur or of the startup. But what I see us doing more and more is people like you both, you're kind of translators. You sit between the startup and the corporate partner and you help translate. Really interesting for me to hear that you actually do training of the people inside of these businesses to help them know how to speak the language of the startup, not just the startup speaking the language of the corporate. Have you got any examples of that, Nick, that you can tell us about?
And I think it's a great point, and we do play that role quite a bit. Because we tend to fall in love with the projects that we do, and a lot of them are small businesses that are getting off the ground, and we can always see the connections that can be made to our member companies. So we have, for example, a small recycler in the Philippines called the Plastic Flamingo. That's the name of the company, and they have come up with a collection and processing approach that is rather straightforward, but what it does do is it takes out a significant amount of plastic waste from the environment in Manila, and it's actually turning that into building products. And again, many of our member companies would see that as a low end of the business, but at the same time, they're recognizing that obviously the future of their business lies in the industry looking after its waste, right, and making sure that plastic waste is not in the environment. So many of them have actually connected in and saw this as a great CSR opportunity. So they see it as a way not only to support a startup to advance their business, but also then to show exactly that plastic waste has a value and that it can be made use of in downstream products. So this company is actually now getting into their second round of advancement, looking to do a fundraise and build their second, which will be a very larger scale plant in another part of the Philippines, and getting quite a bit of interest from some of the smaller venture capital firms here in the region, as well as our member companies, because it's a great thing to do, and they've got a good business model, and it's fitting very well with those CSR or ESG requirements of many member companies.
I love this example, and we're seeing it a lot in the work that we're doing, that corporates are coming to us also to find opportunities for some of their staff members to engage in different types of companies. It's a learning opportunity for their staff members that they can join a startup for 6 months, or they can mentor a startup, and it gives them access to a new type of business. And I think to a certain extent, what you were talking about, Eddie, it might bring someone out of a corporate mindset to like inject them into an education, a new way of thinking about the world. So it's not, I think sometimes we look at this problem from, we've got to get the startup into the corporation, but sometimes another way of thinking about it is getting the corporation into the startup. We've got a few more minutes before we jump over to questions, but Eddie, is there anything else that you wanted to kind of share about this journey, particularly about your journey as an academic to an investor, and now leading one of these kind of translating jobs, if you will, one of these ecosystems jobs, how you look to the future and what you're predicting might happen in the future with regard to how corporates and startups are working together?
Yeah, I'll just have a go because my crystal ball is as good as anybody else's. I think that there are two ways of approaching startup. One is to start by thinking, can we do it? Right? That is a bottoms-up approach, and typically an approach taken by large corporations' R&D arm, where you are looking for incremental change or a new way of building an engine with a different level of efficiency. Right? And that is also the academic mindset, where you are looking for novel ways to achieve an outcome to lead to publication, patent, right? And that is what is required for tenure. A different way of thinking that I'm seeing, especially from the movement of software eats the world, is should we do it, right? Is the lean thinking of thinking, finding out are there customers first? What is the pain of customers with or without your product, right? What is their workaround now? How much are they paying? And identify how much in addition will they pay to buy a green product. What's a green premium? And by doing so, you are segmenting the market. You are identifying who is the new customer you should approach as a first step, right, to your green product before the mass market takes over and everyone now wants to buy a green product because it has reached price parity. An example is EV, right? There's good reason why the Roadster is launched first before the Model 3. So with that thinking, there's greater and greater importance, I think, to understand the customer point of view, and for corporate potentially to work with other corporates, given that most products now are interdisciplinary, right? We talk about biomass digestion with, let's say, anaerobic digestion before they are turned into methane and fertilizer. And that is so multidisciplinary, where the energy company or the agricultural company now have to work with potentially CRISPR techniques, right, to create the new microbe that is more efficient in resulting in the gas, the biogas of the right mixture that they want. So I foresee that large corporations, at least in the innovation team, will start working together to create new opportunities.
Great. I want to pull on one of those strings a little bit more to hand back to you, Nick, but I think what we're understanding in our space, Nick and I were both, Nick was talking about addressing plastic waste, and I think what we're also seeing is that startups alone aren't going to solve these problems, or startups and corporations aren't going to solve these problems alone, or at least an investable startup might not always be the solution to these problems. We do a lot of work with the informal sector, and we're applying innovative kind of lean startup methods to community groups and groups that are out working with informal waste collectors to think about how they can find a business model, iterate on their business model, and say, for example, supply feedstock into a new recycling facility. And if we're thinking about this at an ecosystem level, it's these innovations and these ways of working, they're de-risking a system as opposed to finding just an investable startup. And Nick, a lot of the work that you do is thinking about the supply chain and the entire value chain. So just, love a reflection on how it's not just corporations and it's not just startups, but how we can use some of what we've been talking about on the panel today to kind of think about and solve this problem holistically across the value chain.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely critical. And while we say it always starts with collection, if you don't collect the plastic waste, it's not going to get recycled. What's going to drive that collection is the driving of demand for recyclates, for plastic that is or is going to be recycled. So a couple of the examples that Simon is referring to here, we have projects in Thailand and also in Indonesia. And what we recognize is there's quite a gap in the market in turning what is medium to low value plastics into something that is marketable. And it's happening in other parts of the world. So there's a big opportunity to actually identify and actually support startups to see this as a workable business model, to be having maybe novel ways of collection, but also setting up maybe not a super innovative business, but a business that can fill a niche in the market. And this is maybe an example in our space, but it probably exists in a lot of other spaces as well. And we've seen that as an opportunity to then drive demand, which we're getting partly from our member companies because they're looking for recycled plastic to use to meet their obligations that they've published, but also to take that lower end of the market and create those opportunities. And that is actually quite exciting because then you're not only just trying to uncover a startup, but you're actually supporting them to move in a direction that is going to be good for them that may not have been realized in that sector of the market in a certain geography.
Could I just add to that? What you just said reminded me of an interesting company I saw in India. They were using manual work to collect waste, and they are giving out bins and educating the residents to separate their product. What they were most interested in is flexible plastic and rigid plastic. And they really struggled to have the right unit economics until they realized that the data on what they collect is so useful. Because after they have sorted the plastics manually, they realized that they could note down, what are the brands and what did they sell in different parts of the city. Yeah. And the likes of Kellogg's right now is paying for their data.
Indeed.
And that revenue stream has fed back into robotics, where they're building their robots to do the sorting.
Exactly.
So the right business model is really important.
And I think those are great examples. And we have a couple of startups in our network. One of them called Literati, who came through the Plug and Play program out of Silicon Valley. And they're actually crowdsourcing data. So you put the app on your phone, and they use crowdsourced data actually to drive solutions in cities. So they sell their service with that crowdsourced data to a city to address certain aspects of a problem. So for example, in the city of Vienna in Austria, they're still smoking quite a lot and they're littering, not like here in Singapore. And so they used actually people on their Literati app to identify hotspots of cigarette butts so that they could hopefully get people to stop smoking, which would be great, but actually more importantly to find out where they should put the ashtrays so that the cigarette butts are not getting washed into the drains and into the river. So again, a great example of a startup that's found an opportunity to marry technology with people who are passionate about the topic of waste and waste management, and then to utilize that to support a city to define what is the right solution for them. They've got quite a few examples, great little startup that we've worked with.
Wonderful, thank you both. I want to sum up a couple of key points that I think were important for me during the session, and then we'll hand it back to the audience for questions. One is that there's lots of different ways to work with corporates, for startups and corporates to work together. Eddie, you spoke about a range of different models from hackathons all the way through to mergers and acquisitions and venture capital. We also spoke about the need not to just think about the startup and what the startup needs to do to get into a corporate, but how we can leverage corporates to get into startups and how that marriage is really beneficial for an ecosystem. Yeah. I think, and then I think finally we also spoke about wanting to work at the ecosystem level. Nick, I love that you talked about kind of this idea of supply and demand. 10 years ago, accelerators and hackathons were just focusing on the supply side of startups and the supply side of innovation. But if we can really draw on and create demand, by nature of these people's personality, they will find a way of solving that problem and solving that demand. So they were three key takeaways from me. Nick, it looked like you had another one.
Well, I got actually one thing, because we're working with NUS here today and this event, it's another great way to connect to corporates is actually through university programs. And the Alliance is also working with NUS and actually NTU here in Singapore. But with NUS, we have a plastic waste to roads, so a paving green roads project where we're looking at the viability of using plastic waste as a component of asphalt in road paving. And it's a great opportunity to work with academia to kind of identify what are the challenges in doing that, and both environmental and economic, but also then where are the opportunities to then turn that into a business. And there's a space for startups to maybe be a bit of an intermediary to play a role there, because that's not going to be something that's going to happen easily, right? So there's the academic side where these things are where the solutions are being defined, and then maybe the business models are emerging, and an opportunity to connect with companies that want to make it part of the solution.
Yeah, great reminder. It's a really interesting story, actually, about a young female entrepreneur. One of the technologies that Nick is talking about that NUS is doing some research on, she's a young female entrepreneur from Singapore who's developed a company. Her family's company was in laying roads. She's developed this technology. DBS has sponsored her as well. And so it's another great story of how the startup kind of progression is one of many. You know, you talk about raising a village, taking a village to raise a child. I think we can have the same analogy. We need corporate partnerships, we need investors, we need universities, and we need mentors and others to kind of create that enabling environment for startups to thrive. In the spirit of thanking NUS, there's a couple of programs that I want to mention that they also run to help be a connector in the ecosystem. Their technology access program that creates structured modes of discovery for startups, technology and IP at NUS is one example of this. The Graduate Innovation Research Program is another, as well as some corporate partnerships that they have got up and running with the Alliance, as well as Capital Land and Cocoa Group and others. So if you're a corporation interested in this space, please speak to my colleagues at the front of the room from NUS. If you're a startup who's looking to understand the ecosystem here in Singapore, another great access point there. We have 10 minutes of an opportunity for questions. I want to give the opportunity for people to raise their hand. Please introduce yourself and start with the question. Gentleman in the front.
Hi. My name is Laszlo. I run a climate startup, or we're addressing climate change. One of the issues I see with engaging with corporations is IP. And I had a really bad experience there. 5 years ago, I was working with an accelerator and with a venture capital arm of an oil company. I don't want to name any companies, but they're based in the UK. And we were working with them for about half a year, and it was always pushed like this: yeah, we want to invest, and then, oh, we just need to review this, and another month. And after about 6 months of working really closely together and spending a lot of time with them, they quite frankly told us, yeah, we can do this without you, great idea. So how do you see that?
I think it's a very important point, and I think the startup needs to make sure that they are protected. You'd hope that big corporations are supporting in the right way, but I think that is an important aspect to ensure that you're managing things. Just as a starting point, we sign a lot of NDAs, so making sure that we're crystal clear at the very earliest stage, and then working from there into more protective measures so that you're looked after. I think it's a good heads up to have for a lot of startups.
I think the large corporation is not faceless, right? There are different divisions, but more importantly are the exact people that you're working with. And it's important that the foreground IP, it should be co-owned. The background IP is clearly respected and documented. And the startup is not going to sue the large corporation, let's face it. right? But what's really important is not to lose time and opportunity for the startup, because your runway will kill you if you make the wrong step. And it is very important for you to find the corporates who are committed in the long run. And I'll just speak for the programs that I've seen, the examples that have worked, for example, at Startup Bootcamp, where Shell committed to a multi-year program, Mitsubishi committed to a 3-year program to work with startups, to look for startups, batches of startup every year. That's because they understand that the proof of concept takes time to conceive. Getting the people introduced to develop the trust is not easy, right? And crafting out the dimensions around the POC might easily take a year. So both sides have to be, and the expectation of both sides has to be very clear on what they get into. And of course, you need the middleman to make sure that both sides are playing ball and making sure that things are pushing ahead. So I hope your example, your experience is not unique to yourself. I've heard so many death by pilot, where startups go through rounds and rounds of small pilots that do not lead to contract with various corporations because the expectation is not aligned while going into the conversation. Yeah, happy to have a chat with you later to see if we could be of help. Yeah.
Question at the back, gentleman in the grey jacket. And then over here. This one, we can go this one first and then over here. Yep.
Hi, I'm Raghav Maheshwari. I'm the founder of a sustainable packaging manufacturing company called Origin Biopack. And we are based out of India. So I have 2 questions. One is, how can a young manufacturing company create an impact at scale? So we have already got pilot tests from Amazon India and also Walmart Group. But I just want to know that how can we, as a very young manufacturing company, cater to all these giant e-commerce companies? And second is, how can we help them track the carbon footprint that they are able to lower through all these dispatches or all these e-commerce deliveries? So these are the 2 questions I want to know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll have a shot at this. I think it very much depends on the packaging that you are building, right? The right down to the raw materials, what's the usage of the package, and who's the end customer, right? Because your scalability, you should never do this alone. You should look for partnership, right? As a startup, you need to look for niche market or develop your own niche to go into, right? I don't believe that you should go into a commoditized market. You might be going into certain, perhaps traceable packaging, perhaps for specialty product. That might be your entry point, but that is by no means the end for you, right? That is only the beginning. And the other point is that large corporations are all caring about their traceability of their product. When it comes to carbon emission, which is my specialty, they care about the supply chain, the scope 3 emission. So if you are able to be extremely clear about your own scope 3, the origin of your product, the logistics emission, you can pass this information into your supply chain, which is highly valuable. And there are so many startups over the last 2 years that's popped up to work on measurement, reporting and verification, MRV, but yet there's no clear winner yet. So if you could identify corporates who care about scope 3, and that could very well be your specialty.
I think, yeah, just to reiterate that point, I think it's a potential massive competitive advantage if you are able to understand in detail your emissions, your own internal ones, which then pass across to helping your partners understand them from their scope 3 perspective. It can be a differentiator in the market. Anything to add?
I would just say that, again, the packaging producers produce at scale, typically, and that's, as was said, if it's a commodity area, unless you have something that's very niche or a business model advantage as well, that's going to be a challenge. But I think that's probably where you're sitting, is having a niche and maybe having a business model advantage there as well.
Gentleman in the back.
Very good evening to the panelists. So my name is Gaurav Medi. I'm from India. My state is Assam. Actually, sir, we are working on compressed biogas project. And when we have completed almost 3 days here in Singapore, but I have seen the waste management is really wonderful. And so our product is from waste to energy. And even we all know, and even you must be aware that India is moving towards gas-based economy. And one of our fixed customer is Indian Oil Corporation. So we have signed an understanding with them, OMC. So, sir, my question is, I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to collaborate with few startups who is working with the waste management, and also I'm looking forward to for more technological support, because this project is really huge and I need support from all of you as much as we can.
Wonderful. It sounds like a question that maybe we could tackle on a conversation after the panel, and give an opportunity for a couple more questions from the audience, if there are any. Anything else from anyone? We still have a couple of minutes left if there's a burning question. If not, we might wrap things up and give you an opportunity to come and speak to people individually. Anything else? Great. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone very much. Wonderful to see a full audience. Thank you to the two panelists for the conversation. We'll be around, so please come and ask any of us any questions if you want. And thank you to NUS for pulling this panel together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.